Sometimes a man just wants to be left alone with his memories in the quiet of the mountains. There comes a time in every warrior's life when the weight of old battles becomes too heavy to carry into new ones. Harek the Broadback had walked away from war, seeking peace in the highlands of Skagard after defeating 3 clan chieftains in single combat for the territory. For years, no man dared cross into his domain. The ancient pact held strong, but one brutal winter, desperate raiders chose to break that sacred agreement. They thought they would find an aging hermit living in solitude. Instead, they discovered why even the boldest warriors spoke Harek's name only in whispers. What happens when men who have forgotten honor meet a legend who never forgot the price of respect? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story moves you, subscribe because tomorrow brings something extraordinary. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like the breath of sleeping gods, and Harek Eriksson stood at the edge of his domain watching the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of copper and gold. 15 winters had passed since he'd claimed these highlands, and each dawn still brought him the same quiet satisfaction, the knowledge that here, among the ancient stones and whispering trees, he had found something rarer than treasure or glory. He had found peace. Above his stone hearth, wrapped in oiled leather and secured with iron bands, hung Grimfrost, the war axe that had carved his legend across the northern kingdoms. The weapon's broad head bore the scars of 100 battles, its edge honed to perfection. Even now, though Harek hadn't drawn it in anger for more years than some men had been alive. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of winter nights, he would catch himself staring at those leather wrappings, remembering the weight of steel in his hands and the terrible song it sang when unleashed upon enemies. But those were moments he pushed away like unwelcome visitors, reminders of a man he had chosen not to be. The contest that won him these mountains had been his final act of war, though the 3 chieftains who challenged him that day had not understood they were witnessing the end of an era. They saw only opportunity in the fertile valleys of Skagard. Rich soil for crops, clear streams for water, and high ground perfect for defense. What they failed to see was that Harek the Broadback had already grown weary of conquest, tired of the endless cycle of raid and revenge that consumed so many Norse lives like a hungry flame. Bjorn Ironwill of the eastern clans had been the first to issue challenge, his massive frame bristling with confidence as he proclaimed his right to rule the highlands. "I have 40 ships and twice as many warriors," he had declared that autumn day, standing before the sacred stone of Kaldskin where ancient kings once held court. "Who here can match the strength of the Ironwill clan?" Then came Olaf, the cunning from the southern fjords, his silver tongue weaving promises of prosperity and trade. "Strength alone does not make a king," he had countered, his dark eyes gleaming with ambition. "These lands need wisdom, not just muscle. I offer both sword and strategy." But it was Eric Bloodaxe of the Western Reaches who had spoken last, his scarred face twisted in a grin that held no warmth. "You speak of ships and wisdom," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of old wounds. "But I speak of fear. Men follow me because they know what happens to those who don't. These mountains will respect strength, or they will learn to." Harek had listened to their boasting from beneath the great oak where he sat sharpening Grimfrost, the rhythmic scrape of whetstone against steel, the only sound he contributed to their debate. When they finally turned to him, the giant they had heard whispered about in ale halls and warrior lodges across the northern lands. He had simply stood and spoken 6 words that changed everything. "Winner takes all. Losers leave peacefully." The sacred stone of Kaldskin had witnessed the contest that followed, its ancient surface stained with the blood of kings and heroes for generations beyond counting. Each chieftain fought with the fury of men who believed destiny favored them, but Harek fought with something different, the calm certainty of a warrior who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect. He moved like winter itself, inexorable and patient, wearing them down one by one until they yielded or fell. Bjorn Ironwill had been the last to surrender, his great strength finally spent after an hour of brutal combat. As he knelt in the frost-covered grass, breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, he had looked up at Harek with something approaching awe. "How?" he gasped. "How does a man fight like that?" Harek had extended his hand to help the fallen chieftain to his feet, an act of respect that surprised everyone present. "A man fights hardest," he had replied, "when he knows what peace is worth." The three defeated leaders had honored their word, departing with their warriors and leaving the highlands to their new lord. But Harek had done something unexpected with his victory. He had dismissed the handful of followers who had come with him, keeping only enough supplies for one man to survive the approaching winter. "I fought for solitude," he told them, "not subjects." That first winter had been the hardest, not because of cold or hunger, but because of silence. After decades of command, of constant decisions and endless responsibilities, the absence of human voices had felt like a weight pressing against his chest. But as the months passed and spring returned to paint the mountainsides with wild flowers, Harek discovered that silence could heal as surely as any herb or poultice. He built his dwelling with his own hands, choosing a site where 3 valleys converged, giving him clear sight lines in all directions while remaining hidden from casual travelers. The structure was simple but solid. Thick stone walls that would shed the fierce mountain winds, a roof of overlapping pine logs sealed with pitch and moss, and a central hearth large enough to warm the entire space even in the depths of winter. Around the main building, he constructed smaller structures: a smokehouse for preserving meat, a workshop where he could maintain his weapons and tools, and a storehouse dug deep into the rocky hillside where supplies could be kept safe from both weather and wildlife. The mountains became his teachers in ways no human instructor ever could. He learned to read the subtle signs that warned of approaching storms, the particular quality of light that preceded the season's first snow, the tracks and trails that revealed which animals moved through his domain and when. He discovered which plants could heal and which could harm, where the purest water could be found, and how to move through the forest without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf. Years flowed past like the streams that carved their patient paths down the mountainsides. Occasionally, travelers would approach his borders, traders seeking passage through the high country, hunters following game trails, or young warriors testing their courage against the legend of the hermit giant. Harek dealt with each according to their intent and manner. Respectful travelers found fresh water and sometimes a warm meal before being directed to safe passage. Those who came with ill intent discovered that the mountain held more dangers than they had imagined, though Harek rarely had to reveal himself to discourage them. The boundary stones he placed around his territory served as both warning and promise. Each marker bore runes carved by his own hand, telling any who could read the old script that these lands were claimed and protected. But the stones also offered guidance, directions to safe passage around the territory, warnings about dangerous areas where the unwary might fall to their deaths, and symbols that promised aid to those in genuine need. Winter was his favorite season, when the deep snows sealed the mountain passes and ensured months of uninterrupted solitude. During these long, quiet months, he would sit by his fire and remember not the battles and bloodshed that had made his name feared across the northern kingdoms, but the quieter moments between wars. The taste of his mother's bread when he returned from his first raid. The way his sister laughed when he told her stories of distant lands. The feeling of accomplishment when he helped his father repair the roof of their family longhouse. It was during one such winter evening, as the wind howled through the pines and snow piled deep against his walls, that Harek first sensed the change coming. Something in the quality of the storm spoke of desperation beyond mere weather, a harshness that promised hard choices for men and beasts alike. As he sat listening to the wind's voice, one hand absently touching the wrapped handle of Grimfrost where it hung above the hearth, He felt the stirring of an old instinct that had kept him alive through countless battles. The winter that was coming would test more than just his solitude. It would test the very peace he had built with such careful patience, stone by stone and season by season. And though he could not yet see what form that test would take, Harek the Broadback began to prepare his mind for the possibility that his long exile from war might soon be ending. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside his stone sanctuary, surrounded by the simple possessions that marked his chosen life, Harek closed his eyes and tried to hold on to the peace he had fought so hard to win. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight he was still just a man who had chosen solitude over glory, silence over acclaim. But grim frost hung heavy on its pegs above the fire, waiting with the patient stillness of a weapon that knew its true master's nature better than the man himself. The winter that came to the northern kingdoms that year was the kind men would speak of in hushed voices for generations, a season so brutal it seemed the gods themselves had turned their faces away from the world of mortals. The fjords froze solid for the first time in living memory. Livestock died in their pens despite the warmest shelters men could build. Even the great longhouses, with their central fires and thick walls, could not keep out the killing cold that settled over the land like a curse. In the coastal settlements where Bjorn the Desperate had once commanded respect as a minor jarl, the situation grew dire with each passing day. His small band of followers, men who had once raided successfully along the eastern shores, now huddled in a drafty hall, watching their food stores dwindle to nothing. The tattered clan banner of the Black Ravens hung from the rafters above them, its once proud fabric now patched and faded, a fitting symbol of their fallen fortunes. "We have perhaps 10 days of grain left," muttered Tormund the Thin, his skeletal frame hunched over the dying embers of their fire. "Maybe less if we don't start rationing more strictly." Bjorn stared into the flames, his weathered face carved deep with lines of worry and desperation. Once he had been a proud warrior with 3 ships and 60 men. Now he commanded barely a dozen starving followers in a hall that leaked wind through gaps in the walls. The successful raids that had sustained them through previous winters were impossible now. The seas were frozen, the coastal settlements better defended, and his reputation had suffered too many defeats. "The merchant ships won't return until spring," said Gunnar Redbeard, his voice barely above a whisper. "And we've nothing left to trade even if they did." "What about the inland settlements?" suggested another. "Man, surely some of the farming villages have surplus grain stored away." Bjorn shook his head slowly. "Those closest to us are as starved as we are, and the prosperous ones are too well defended." He paused, then added quietly, "or too far to reach in this weather." The hall fell silent except for the wind whistling through the gaps in the roof timbers. Each man sat wrapped in whatever furs and cloaks he could gather, breath visible in small puffs of vapor. They were warriors reduced to the most basic struggle of all, simple survival. It was young Harold who spoke the words that had been haunting all their thoughts. What about Skagard? The silence that followed was deeper than before, weighted with fear and desperate hope in equal measure. Every man present knew the stories of the mountain territory to the north, the fertile valleys protected by ancient pact and watched over by a giant who had walked away from war but never forgotten how to wage it. "The valleys there are sheltered," Harold continued, his voice gaining strength. "Rich soil, clear streams that don't freeze, game in the forests, enough to sustain us through the winter and beyond." "And they're forbidden," Tormund said flatly, "protected by oath and pact. No man enters those lands without invitation." "Pacts made in times of plenty," Bjorn said slowly, his mind already working through the implications. "But these aren't ordinary times. Men do extraordinary things when they're dying." Gunnar leaned forward, his red beard catching the firelight. "You're talking about breaking sacred oaths, about trespassing on territory won fairly in combat before witnesses." "I'm talking about survival," Bjorn replied. About keeping my men alive through a winter that's already killed half the livestock in the northern settlements." "And what of Harek the Broadback?" asked another warrior. "The stories say he defeated 3 chieftains in single combat to win those lands. They say he's more legend than man now, that the mountains themselves obey his will." Bjorn stood and walked to where the black raven banner hung, reaching up to touch its frayed edges. Stories grow in the telling. Yes, he won those lands fairly. Yes, he was once a great warrior, but that was 15 winters ago. He's older now, alone, probably gone soft from years of peace and solitude. "Or harder," Tormund said quietly. "Some men age like steel. The more they're tempered, the stronger they become." "Perhaps," Bjorn acknowledged. "But what choice do we have? Stay here and starve with honor, or take a chance that an aging hermit won't put up much resistance to a dozen armed men?" The debate continued through the night, voices rising and falling with the wind outside. Some argued for honor, for finding another way that didn't involve breaking sacred oaths. Others spoke of responsibility to their families, of the women and children in other settlements who depended on them for protection and provision. By dawn, the decision had been made, not through unanimous agreement, but through the simple arithmetic of desperation. They would travel north to Skagard, hoping to find enough game and shelter in the lower valleys to survive the winter. If the hermit giant tried to stop them, they would deal with that threat when it arose. "We'll take only what we need," Bjorn announced as his men prepared for the journey. "Hunt only enough game to feed us, shelter only in the outer valleys." Perhaps the old warrior will understand necessity when he sees it. But even as he spoke the words, Bjorn felt the weight of the choice they were making. Breaking sacred oaths was not something warriors did lightly, and the man they were preparing to face was no ordinary opponent. Still, the alternative was slow starvation, and that was a fate no proud warrior could accept while strength remained in his body. They departed at midday, moving carefully through the deep snow on skis crafted from ash wood and sinew. Each man carried his weapons and a small pack of supplies, not much, but all they could spare from their dwindling stores. The black raven banner remained behind, too heavy and conspicuous for the journey ahead. The path to Skagard led through treacherous mountain passes, but Bjorn and his men were skilled in traveling through harsh country. They moved in single file, following game trails and natural shelters, making steady progress despite the bitter cold. The knowledge that they were heading toward forbidden territory hung over them like a storm cloud, but desperation drove them forward step by careful step. On the second day of their journey, they reached the outer boundaries of Harek's domain, the ancient warning stones that marked the beginning of protected territory. Each marker stood taller than a man, carved from local granite and inscribed with runes that told of consequences for those who entered without permission. "Last chance to turn back," Gunnar said quietly, reading the warnings inscribed on the nearest stone. Bjorn studied the markers for a long moment, weighing honor against survival, oath against necessity. Behind them lay certain starvation. Ahead lay unknown danger, but also the possibility of life. "We continue," he decided, "but carefully. We're not raiders now. We're desperate men seeking shelter. Perhaps that distinction will matter to whoever we encounter." As they crossed the invisible line marked by the ancient stones, each man felt the weight of the choice they were making. They had broken sacred oaths, violated territory won in honorable combat, and challenged agreements that had kept peace in the northern mountains for over a decade. None of them spoke of the stories they had heard about what happened to men who trespassed in Skagard. None of them mentioned the whispered tales of intruders found frozen in the snow, their faces locked in expressions of terror that suggested their deaths had been neither quick nor merciful. They simply pressed forward into the forbidden territory, driven by necessity and hope in equal measure, unaware that they were being watched by eyes that had learned to read the mountains like runes carved in stone. Harek felt their presence the moment they crossed his boundaries, the way a spider senses tremors in its web. He had not survived 15 winters of solitude by ignoring the subtle signs that spoke of human intrusion, the silence of birds where there should be song, the nervous movements of deer fleeing toward deeper forest, the almost imperceptible change in the mountain's rhythm that came when strangers walked paths meant only for his feet. He stood motionless among the pine trees at the edge of a small clearing, his massive frame so still he might have been another tree trunk draped in winter furs. His breath made no visible vapor in the cold air, a trick learned long ago for remaining unseen while observing enemies. Below in the valley, he could make out the line of dark figures moving carefully through the snow, following the natural contours of the land with the skill of experienced travelers. 12 men, he counted. Armed, but not heavily armored, moving with the careful precision of those who respected the danger of mountain travel. They were not random bandits or glory-seeking youngsters testing their courage against his legend. These men had purpose, and that made them far more dangerous than casual trespassers. Around the perimeter of his territory, placed at intervals known only to him, stood the warning stones, ancient markers he had carved himself during his first winter of exile. Each granite pillar bore runes that spoke clearly to any who could read the old script. These lands are claimed. Enter with respect or face the consequence of broken oaths. The intruders had read his warnings and chosen to ignore them. That told Harek everything he needed to know about their desperation and their intent. He moved through the forest like a ghost, using trails he had worn into the mountainside over years of patient exploration. Every tree, every boulder, every hidden depression in the land was as familiar to him as the scars on his hands. He could traverse his entire domain without ever setting foot on ground where an enemy might expect to find tracks. From his elevated position, Harek observed the raiders make camp in a sheltered grove near the boundary of his outer territory. They worked efficiently, setting up lean-to shelters against the wind and building a small fire that produced minimal smoke. These were not amateur hunters. They understood the value of remaining hidden and the importance of conserving their strength. But they also made small mistakes that revealed their true nature to eyes that knew how to read such signs. The way they positioned their weapons suggested men accustomed to expecting attack from human enemies rather than natural dangers. Their camp layout favored quick escape routes rather than protection from mountain weather. Most telling of all, they posted guards watching outward from their camp rather than observing the surrounding forest for signs of the territory's guardian. As evening approached, Harek made his first move in what he already recognized would be a careful game of hunter and hunted. He began by altering the environment around their camp in subtle ways, moving fallen logs to block certain paths while opening others, rearranging stones to create patterns that would be obvious to observant eyes, adjusting branches so shadows fell in unnatural ways. The goal was not yet to frighten them into flight, but to make them aware they were being watched by something that understood their presence better than they understood his. Fear would come later, after they had time to reflect on the implications of what they observed. From his concealed position, Harek listened to their conversation around the fire. Their words carried clearly in the still mountain air, and what he heard confirmed his suspicions about their desperation. These were not raiders seeking easy plunder, but starving men driven to break sacred oaths by the brutal winter that gripped the northern lands. Understanding their motivation did not change his responsibility to protect what was his, but it added complexity to the choices he would need to make. Honor demanded that he defend his territory against all intrusion. Mercy suggested that desperate men deserved the chance to understand their error and withdraw peacefully. The leader, a weathered warrior who carried himself with the authority of command, spoke of staying only long enough to hunt sufficient game for survival. He promised his men they would take only what necessity demanded, that they would respect the land even as they violated the oaths that protected it. Pretty words, Harek thought, but words were wind. He had heard similar promises from other men over the years, spoken with equal sincerity and broken with equal ease when circumstance made honor inconvenient. As full darkness settled over the mountain, Harek began the second phase of his observation. Moving with the absolute silence of a predator born to hunt in these forests, he crept close enough to study each individual raider. Their equipment told stories about their past and their current circumstances. Well-maintained weapons suggested men who understood their tools, but patched clothing and worn gear spoke of lean times and difficult choices. Their leader interested him most. The man moved with the careful economy of an experienced warrior, but his eyes held the haunted quality of someone who had been forced to make choices no honorable man should face. This was not a berserker seeking glory in death, nor a young fool testing himself against legend. This was a veteran warrior, driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control. That knowledge changed nothing about what Harek would need to do, but it influenced how he would approach the inevitable confrontation. These men deserved the chance to understand what they faced and choose their path accordingly. Near midnight, when the camp had settled into the rhythm of watch rotation, Harek left his first clear sign of his presence. Moving like a shadow through their carefully arranged perimeter, he adjusted their stacked weapons so they formed a different pattern, one that spelled out a message in the old runes for any who could read them: "You are seen." Then he withdrew to higher ground to watch their reaction when morning came. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest, and both sides would need to choose their moves carefully. The territory of Skagard had been peaceful for 15 winters, but peace was a fragile thing that required constant protection. Harek touched the handle of the long knife at his belt. Not Grimfrost, which remained wrapped above his distant hearth, but a tool equally well suited to sending clear messages to those who might mistake his restraint for weakness. The intruders would learn who watched over these mountains, and then they would choose whether to leave peacefully or face the consequences of their broken oaths. Either way, the ancient pact that protected Skagard would be honored. Dawn brought the first real test of nerves for Bjorn's men. Gunnar Redbeard, taking the final watch before sunrise, was the first to notice that their carefully stacked weapons had been rearranged during the night. The spears and axes now formed a pattern none of them had created, ancient runes that spelled out a message as clear as spoken words to those who could read the old script. "You are seen," Gunnar whispered, his voice barely audible in the morning stillness. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the camp as the other men awakened to find evidence of their watcher's presence. Some suggested it might have been wild animals disturbing their gear, but the precise arrangement of weapons told a different story. Whatever had visited their camp in the darkness possessed both intelligence and a deliberate intent to communicate. Bjorn studied the runic message with the grim attention of a man who understood he was no longer the hunter in this situation. "He knows we're here," he said quietly. "Has probably been watching us since we crossed his boundary." "Should we move camp?" asked Harold, his youthful bravado somewhat diminished by the realization that their every movement was being observed. "No," Bjorn decided after a moment's consideration. "Running now would only confirm our weakness. We continue as planned, but with greater caution." Throughout the morning, as they broke their meager fast and prepared to venture deeper into the forbidden territory, the men found themselves glancing repeatedly at the surrounding forest. Every shadow might conceal watching eyes. Every sound of wind through branches might mask approaching footsteps. The knowledge that an unseen guardian monitored their presence transformed the peaceful mountain wilderness into something far more ominous. Harek, observing from his concealed position high above their camp, noted their reaction with professional interest. These were experienced warriors who understood the implications of what they had discovered, but they were not yet frightened enough to abandon their mission. Fear would require a more direct demonstration of his capabilities. He withdrew deeper into the forest, moving to a position where the ancient bone whistle of the mountain spirits hung from its leather cord around his neck. The instrument was a relic from the old days, carved from the thigh bone of a great elk and inscribed with symbols that predated the runes. When blown properly, it produced sounds that seemed to come from the mountain itself. haunting calls that echoed off stone faces and twisted through valleys in ways that made their source impossible to locate. As the raiders began their cautious exploration of his territory, searching for game trails and suitable hunting grounds, Harek began his psychological campaign in earnest. The whistle's first note, low and mournful, drifted across the mountainside like the voice of a restless spirit. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off cliff faces and reverberating through hidden canyons until it became impossible to determine its origin. The raiders stopped immediately, weapons drawn, searching the forest around them for threats they could not identify. The whistle's call faded into silence, leaving only the ordinary sounds of wind and creaking timber. "What in Thor's name was that?" Harold whispered, his knuckles white where he gripped his spear. Before anyone could answer, the sound came again, this time from a different direction entirely, as if whatever produced it had moved impossible distances in moments. The bone whistle's voice carried notes of warning and mourning, speaking to something primitive in the human spirit that recognized the presence of powers beyond mortal understanding. Tormund the Thin, whose gaunt frame seemed to tremble with each haunting note, voiced what they were all thinking. The stories say he has congress with the mountain spirits, that he learned their ways during his years of solitude. "Stories," Bjorn said firmly, though his own voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Men tell tales to make legends seem larger than life. There are rational explanations for strange sounds in mountains." But as the day progressed and the mysterious calls continued to follow their movements, sometimes near, sometimes distant, always impossible to locate precisely, the raiders found their confidence steadily eroding. They managed to bring down a small deer with a well-placed arrow, but the success felt hollow when every moment was shadowed by the sense of being watched and judged by unseen eyes. The psychological pressure was taking its toll, in other ways as well. Men who had fought side by side for years began snapping at each other over minor disagreements. The constant vigilance required to watch for their mysterious guardian left them exhausted even when they should have been resting. Worst of all, the knowledge that they were violating sacred oaths hung over everything they did like a curse waiting to manifest. During their evening meal, as they shared the venison from their successful hunt, the conversation turned to the stories they had all heard about the hermit giant who ruled these mountains. "My grandfather served with Harek the Broadback during the Lindisfarne raids," said one of the older warriors. "Said he was the strongest man he ever saw, but also the most controlled. Never lost his temper, never wasted motion in battle, never showed mercy to enemies, but always honored surrender." "That was 40 years ago," Gunnar pointed out. "Men change. Years of solitude could have driven him mad, made him unpredictable. Or made him wise," Tormund countered quietly. "Some say hermits learn truth that escape men who live surrounded by the noise of others." As darkness fell and they prepared for another night in the forbidden territory, each man was acutely aware that their unseen watcher remained active. The bone whistle's haunting calls continued sporadically through the evening, sometimes close enough to raise goosebumps on their arms, sometimes so distant they might have been imagination. Bjorn doubled the watch, assigning 2 men to each shift and instructing them to remain alert for any sign of approach. But he suspected their guardian was far too skilled to be detected by conventional sentries. The man they faced had spent 15 years learning every tree and stone in these mountains, perfecting his ability to move unseen through terrain he knew better than they knew their own heartbeats. As he settled into his furs for an uneasy sleep, Bjorn found himself wondering if breaking the sacred pact had been the desperate decision of a starving man or the first step toward a doom none of them would survive to regret. The third morning brought evidence that their guardian had grown bolder during the night. Bjorn awakened to find his shield, the ancient iron-bound disc called Ironheart that bore the scars of countless battles, had been moved from beside his sleeping furs to the center of their camp. It stood upright, balanced against a spear shaft that had been driven into the frozen ground with such force that the wood quivered in the morning breeze. More disturbing than the shield's relocation was what had been placed upon it. A single white stone, worn smooth by countless seasons of mountain weather, positioned precisely at the center of the iron boss. To eyes trained in the old ways, the meaning was unmistakable. It was an offering of parley, a chance for words before the situation escalated to bloodshed. "He could have killed any of us during the night," Gunnar observed, his voice tight with the realization of their vulnerability. "Instead, he moves our gear and leaves tokens. What manner of warrior are we dealing with?" Bjorn lifted the white stone from his shield, feeling its weight in his palm. The surface was perfectly smooth, shaped by patient years of water and wind until it resembled a miniature egg. Such stones were often used in ancient rituals of peacemaking, symbols of new beginnings and the possibility of transformation. "One who still follows the old codes," Bjorn replied slowly. "He offers us the chance to speak before we fight." The discovery split the raiders into two camps more clearly than any debate had managed. Half the men, led by Tormund, argued for accepting the offered parley. They pointed out that their mysterious guardian could have slain them all while they slept, yet had chosen restraint. Perhaps negotiation could find a solution that honored both necessity and ancient oaths. The other half, led by Harold's youthful aggression, saw only weakness in their enemy's hesitation. "If he wanted to talk, why not simply approach our camp like a man?" Harold demanded. "This skulking in shadows and mysterious tokens, it's the behavior of someone trying to frighten us into retreat. Or someone testing our character," Bjorn said quietly, his weathered fingers turning the white stone over and over. "Seeing if we're honorable men driven by necessity or common raiders using hunger as excuse for theft." The debate continued through their morning meal, voices rising and falling with the mountain wind that whistled through the pine boughs overhead. Some men argued that accepting parley showed weakness, that Vikings should face their enemies with steel rather than words. Others countered that wisdom lay in understanding one's opponent before committing to a battle that might prove unnecessary. Harek, watching from his concealed position among the ancient trees, read the divisions among the raiders with the eye of a commander who had spent decades judging men's characters. The young ones wanted simple solutions, fight or flee, win or lose. The older warriors understood that the most dangerous battles were often those that need never have been fought at all. He had chosen the white stone deliberately, knowing that any leader worth following would recognize both its meaning and the opportunity it represented. The test was not whether Bjorn would accept the offer of parley, but how he would handle the disagreement among his men. A weak leader would be swayed by the loudest voices. A wise one would make his decision based on the welfare of those he led. As the sun climbed higher and the discussion among the raiders continued, Harek found himself reflecting on his own motives for offering negotiation. 15 years of solitude had not erased his warrior instincts, but they had given him perspective on the true cost of violence. Every conflict resolved without bloodshed was a victory that left no widows, no orphaned children, no festering hatred to poison future generations. Yet he also understood that mercy shown to the wrong men could be perceived as weakness, encouraging further violations of his territory. The sacred pact that protected Skagard had been honored for 15 winters precisely because potential trespassers believed the consequences of violation would be swift and terrible. The balance between justice and mercy was the most delicate calculation any leader faced, made more complex by the knowledge that desperate men often made choices their better selves would reject. Bjorn and his followers were not evil. They were hungry, frightened men driven to break oaths by circumstances that offered no good alternatives. By midday, Bjorn had made his decision. Standing before his divided band, he spoke with the authority of command while holding the white stone where all could see it. "We are not thieves or oath breakers by choice," he declared. "We are warriors driven to desperate measures by desperate times. If the guardian of these lands offers parley, honor demands we accept." Harold stepped forward, his young face flushed with anger. "And if he demands we leave empty-handed, do we return to our frozen hall to starve with dignity while our families suffer?" "We cross that bridge when we reach it," Bjorn replied firmly. "But we don't abandon the possibility of an honorable solution without exploring what terms might be offered." The decision made, they prepared for the parley with the solemnity of men who understood they might be negotiating for their lives. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, not as preparation for battle, but as marks of respect for a warrior whose reputation commanded such care. Personal grooming received unusual attention, for a man's appearance spoke to his character when words might prove inadequate. As evening approached, Bjorn stood at the edge of their camp, holding the white stone above his head, where any watcher could see it clearly. His voice, trained to carry commands across the chaos of battle, rang out across the mountain wilderness. Harek Eriksson, called the Broadback, guardian of Skagard, and keeper of ancient oaths. "I am Bjorn, son of Magnus, leader of men reduced by harsh winter to desperate choices. You have offered parley through the old signs. I accept, in the name of honor, and the hope that wise men might find solutions where proud ones see only conflict." The words echoed off the mountain faces before fading into silence. For long moments, nothing stirred except wind through the pine needles and the distant cry of a hunting hawk. Then, from the forest depths, came a single, long note from the bone whistle. Not the haunting call of warning they had heard before, but a clear, musical tone that spoke of acceptance and preparation. The parley would take place at dawn, when the mountain mists would provide appropriate ceremony for a meeting between legends. Dawn came gray and solemn to the mountains, shrouded in mist that turned the familiar forest into something ethereal and otherworldly. Bjorn stood at the appointed meeting place, a small clearing marked by a circle of ancient stones that spoke of ceremonies held long before living memory. Around his finger, the blood oath ring felt heavier than usual, its simple band of hammered silver warming against his skin as if responding to the gravity of what was about to unfold. The ring had been given to him by his father on the day he first led men into battle, a simple piece of jewelry that carried the weight of sacred promises. "A man's word is his bond," his father had said, sliding the ring onto Bjorn's finger. "And this ring reminds you that some promises are sealed with more than words. They're sealed with life itself." Now, facing the possibility of negotiating with a legend, Bjorn found himself touching the ring repeatedly, drawing strength from its reminder that honor mattered more than survival, that the promises men made defined them more clearly than the victories they won. He was not alone in the clearing. Behind him, at respectful distance, stood three of his most trusted men, Gunnar, Tormund, and surprisingly, young Harold. The youth had insisted on accompanying them, claiming that since he had been among the most vocal advocates for pressing forward, he bore responsibility for whatever consequences followed. The mist began to thin as the sun climbed higher, and gradually, like a figure emerging from legend itself, Harek the Broadback stepped into the clearing. Bjorn had expected to see a large man. The stories all agreed on that point, but the reality still took his breath away. Harek stood nearly a head taller than any man Bjorn had ever seen, his massive frame clothed in simple mountain garb that did nothing to disguise the power contained within. But it was not his size that commanded attention. It was his presence. He moved with the careful economy of a master warrior, each step deliberate and controlled. His gray-streaked beard was neatly braided, his weapons obviously well maintained despite years of peace. Most striking of all were his eyes, clear blue and utterly calm, holding the kind of steady intelligence that came from years of careful thought and hard-won wisdom. "Bjorn, son of Magnus," Harek said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing without being raised. "You requested parley. Speak your piece." The directness was both refreshing and unsettling. Bjorn had prepared elaborate speeches about necessity and honor, explanations that might justify their violation of sacred oaths. But faced with Harek's steady gaze, such preparations seemed suddenly inadequate. "We are starving," Bjorn said simply. "The worst winter in living memory has driven us to break oaths we would normally die to honor. We seek shelter in your outer valleys and game from your forests. Not from greed, but from the simple need to survive until spring." Harek nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this explanation. "And when spring comes, when the pass is clear and trade resumes, do you simply return to your former territories, having learned that sacred oaths can be broken when convenient?" The question struck at the heart of Bjorn's deepest fear, that this choice, made from necessity, would mark him and his men as oath-breakers for the rest of their lives. "I don't know," he admitted. "I know only that my men will die if we don't find food and shelter soon." "Honesty," Harek observed. "That's rarer than most men realize." He began walking slowly around the perimeter of the stone circle, his movement somehow both casual and intensely focused. "Tell me about your followers. What manner of men have you brought into my domain?" Bjorn glanced back at his companions before answering. "Warriors, mostly. Men who have followed me through good seasons and bad. They're not raiders by choice. Circumstances have reduced us to this. Warriors." Harek stopped his circuit and fixed Bjorn with that penetrating stare. "Then they understand oaths and their importance. They know what they've done by crossing my boundaries." "They do," Bjorn confirmed, "and it weighs on them. But hunger weighs more heavily than honor when children are involved." For the first time, Harek's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes that suggested understanding. "You have families depending on you. Wives, children, elders who helped raise us." Bjorn's voice carried the pain of a leader who felt responsible for more lives than his own. "I cannot watch them starve when action might save them." Harek resumed his slow circuit of the stones, each step measured and deliberate. 15 years ago, I claimed these lands through right of combat. The agreement was clear. No man enters without invitation. Yet here you stand, having broken that pact." "Yes," Bjorn said simply. There was no point in denial or excuse. "And what would you have me do? Ignore the violation? Set a precedent that sacred oaths can be broken whenever men face hardship?" The question hung in the morning air like a sword blade poised to fall. Bjorn felt the weight of his men's lives, his family's survival, and his own honor balanced on the edge of whatever answer he could provide. "I would have you judge us as men, not as symbols," he said finally. "We have broken an oath, yes, but we have done so openly, honestly, and with full understanding of the consequences. We ask not for forgiveness, but for the chance to earn whatever mercy you might offer." Harek stopped his circuit directly in front of Bjorn, the two leaders separated by only a few paces. "And what would you consider fair payment for the violation of my territory and the breaking of sacred agreements?" The question was not what Bjorn had expected. He had prepared for demands that they leave immediately, for challenges to single combat, for any number of traditional responses to trespass. The idea that payment might be possible, that there could be a path forward that preserved both honor and necessity, had not occurred to him. "Name your price," Bjorn said. "If it lies within our power to pay, we will meet your terms." Harek smiled then, a small expression that somehow transformed his entire face from stern judge to something approaching understanding father. "The price is simple, Bjorn, son of Magnus. You will remain in my territory for the winter as my guests rather than as trespassers. You will hunt only what you need, take only what is freely given, and when spring comes, you will carry word to other desperate men that Harek the Broadback offers shelter to those who ask honorably rather than take dishonorably." The offer was so unexpected, so generous that Bjorn felt his knees weaken with relief. But Harald stepped forward, his young voice tight with suspicion. And what stops other men from simply claiming desperation as excuse for breaking any oath they find inconvenient? Harek's attention shifted to the youth, and his smile faded back to neutral assessment. The fact that I will be watching them very carefully indeed. The generosity of Harek's offer should have brought relief to Bjorn's heart, but something in Harald's tone nagged at him like a splinter beneath the skin. The young warrior's question had been too pointed, too knowing, as if he possessed information that had not been shared with the rest of the group. As they prepared to return to their camp to share the unexpected good news, Bjorn found himself studying Harald's face with growing unease. It was Tormund who first voiced the suspicion that had been building in Bjorn's mind. Strange how eager young Harald was to join this expedition, the thin warrior observed quietly as they walked back through the forest. For a man who supposedly had the most to lose by leaving his family behind. Harald's step faltered almost imperceptibly, but Harek's trained eye caught the subtle change in the youth's posture. The giant had been following at a respectful distance, allowing the raiders privacy for their discussions, but his awareness of everything around him never wavered. "Something troubles you about your companion?" Harek asked, his voice carrying the casual tone of one making conversation rather than formal inquiry. Bjorn stopped walking and turned to face Harald directly. "Yes, something does trouble me. Harald, you've been unusually eager to press forward into forbidden territory, unusually prepared with answers about the risks we faced, almost as if you knew more about our destination than the rest of us." The young warrior's face flushed red, but whether from anger or guilt was impossible to determine. "I know what every man in the northern settlements knows, that these mountains hold game and shelter enough to sustain us through winter. Do you?" Harek stepped closer, his massive presence suddenly intimidating rather than protective. "And how does a young warrior from the eastern settlements know so much about territories he's never seen?" Harald's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped as he realized the futility of threatening Harek the Broadback. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and met the giant's gaze with defiant pride. "Because I've been here before," he said, "not in these mountains, but in the hall of Harek Bloodaxe, when he planned his revenge against the hermit who humiliated him 15 years ago." The words fell into the mountain's silence like stones into deep water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward until they touched everything that had happened since the raiders first crossed into Harek's domain. Bjorn felt the blood oath ring on his finger grow cold as the full meaning of Harald's admission became clear. "Harek Bloodaxe," Harek repeated slowly, his voice carrying no emotion at all. "One of the 3 chieftains I defeated at Kaldskin. I had wondered what became of him after he honored his word and withdrew from these lands." Harald's defiance crumbled under the weight of Harek's steady gaze. He rebuilt his strength over the years, gathered new followers, made alliances with desperate men who had their own reasons to hate the hermit of Skagard. When the terrible winter came and men began to starve, he saw his opportunity. "To do what exactly?" Bjorn demanded, his voice tight with the anger of a man who realized he had been manipulated. "To use your desperation as cover for his revenge," Harald confessed. The plan was simple. Let starving men violate the sacred pact, draw the hermit into conflict, then arrive with reinforcements to finish what should have been settled 15 years ago. The revelation recontextualized everything that had transpired since they first crossed the warning stones. Their careful approach, the mysterious signs of surveillance, even the offer of parley, all of it had been observed not just by Harek, but by enemies watching for the perfect moment to strike. "How many men does Harek command now?" Harek asked, his question directed to Harald, but his attention clearly focused on reading the surrounding forest for signs of hidden watchers. 60 warriors. Maybe more. They were to follow 3 days behind us, giving us time to locate you and assess your defenses." Gunnar cursed under his breath, the implications of their situation becoming clear. "We're bait," he said bitterly. "Expendable pawns in someone else's game of revenge." Not just bait, Harek corrected grimly. Witnesses. Eric wants people to see him defeat the legend of Harek the Broadback. Your survival serves his purposes, as long as you live to tell the tale of his victory. From his belt, Harek drew a small object that caught the morning light like a fragment of captured starlight. It was a message stone, a piece of polished quartz inscribed with runes, and designed to carry communications across long distances through a network of trusted messengers. The fact that he possessed such a thing suggested connections that extended far beyond his mountain sanctuary. "This came to me 2 days ago," he said, holding the stone where they could all see the runes carved into its surface. A warning from old friends that Harek Bloodaxe had been gathering men and speaking of settling ancient grudges. I wondered why it had taken him 15 years to work up the courage. Harold stared at the message stone with the expression of a man watching his carefully laid plans crumble into ruin. "You knew? You've known all along that we were part of a larger scheme?" "I suspected," Harek admitted, "but I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that desperate men had simply made a desperate choice, and that mercy might serve better than justice." Bjorn felt the weight of shame settle over him like a burial shroud. "We are desperate," he said quietly. "Our hunger is real, our need genuine. But it seems we've also been tools in the hands of men who care nothing for our survival." "That remains to be seen," Harek replied, his attention once again scanning the forest around them. "Eric's plan required that I be drawn out of my stronghold, made vulnerable through misplaced trust. Instead, he's given me advance warning of his approach and the opportunity to prepare proper welcome for 60 warriors who think they're hunting a lone hermit." The sound of the bone whistle echoed across the mountainside. Not the haunting call they had heard before, but a sharp series of notes that spoke of urgent warning. From multiple directions came answering calls, suggesting a network of watchers that extended throughout Harek's domain. "Your former master moves faster than expected," Harek observed, interpreting the whistle signals with the ease of long practice. "My sentries report armed men approaching from the south, too many to be a casual hunting party." Harold's face went pale as he realized the implications. "He said 3 days. It's only been 2 since we crossed your boundaries." "Perhaps he grew impatient," Bjorn suggested grimly. "Or perhaps he never intended for us to survive long enough to serve as witnesses." Harek began moving toward his stronghold with the purposeful stride of a man who had made his decision. Either way, Harek Bloodaxe will learn that some games are more dangerous than the players realize. The hermit he thinks to hunt has spent 15 years preparing for the possibility that his peace might one day be challenged. As they hurried through the forest, following paths that seemed to appear and disappear at Harek's will, Bjorn found himself wondering if their acceptance of the giant's hospitality had saved their lives or simply ensured they would die in better company. The blood oath ring on his finger seemed to burn with the heat of promises, broken and betrayals revealed. Behind them, carried on the mountain wind, came the distant sounds of men moving through the forest in numbers far greater than 12 desperate raiders. The game of cat and mouse was ending, but the real hunt was just beginning. Harek's stronghold was not what Bjorn had expected from 15 years of stories about the hermit of Skagard. Instead of a simple mountain hut, they found themselves approaching a fortress carved into the living rock of the mountainside. Walls that seemed to grow from the stone itself, positioned to command views of every approach while remaining nearly invisible from below. "How did you?" Gunnar began, then stopped as he realized the magnitude of preparation that lay before them. 15 years is a long time," Harek replied simply, as he led them through a concealed entrance that opened onto a network of defensive positions. "I've had ample opportunity to consider what might be necessary if my peace were ever seriously threatened." Inside the stronghold, the true scope of Harek's preparations became clear. Weapons lined the walls, not just his legendary war axe Grimfrost, but spears, bows, crossbows, and implements of war that spoke of careful planning and methodical preparation. Stores of food, water, and ammunition suggested a man ready for siege warfare rather than simple self-defense. Most striking of all was the storm cloak of the berserkers that hung from a place of honor on the far wall. The garment was magnificent and terrible to behold, crafted from the pelts of great wolves and bears, reinforced with steel plates and inscribed with runes that seemed to writhe and shift in the firelight. It was the kind of armor worn by legendary warriors in the greatest battles, designed not just for protection, but for the psychological impact it would have on enemies. "You've been expecting this day," Bjorn observed, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and apprehension. Harek moved to the storm cloak and ran his fingers along its edge with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. "Not expecting," he corrected, preparing for the possibility. Eric Bloodaxe is not a man to forget humiliation, and humiliation festers in the darkness until it becomes something far more dangerous. Through the stronghold's carefully positioned windows, they could see movement in the forest below, the organized advance of Eric's force as they moved through terrain they believed held only an aging hermit. The morning light glinted off weapons and armor, revealing the true scope of the threat approaching Harek's domain. 60 men, maybe more," Tormund said, counting the glimpses of movement among the trees. "Even for a warrior of your reputation, those are difficult odds." "Difficult, yes," Harek agreed as he began the systematic preparation of his defenses. "But not impossible. Eric makes the same mistake many warriors make. He confuses numbers with advantage." Harold watched from a corner of the stronghold, his earlier defiance replaced by growing horror, as he realized the magnitude of the trap he had helped to spring. "He doesn't know about the fortress," the young warrior said quietly. "His plan assumed you would meet us in the forest, fight on ground of his choosing." "His plan assumed many things that are proving incorrect," Harek replied as he checked the tension on crossbow strings and verified the positioning of defensive obstacles. "The most dangerous assumption was that 15 years of peace had made me soft." From concealed positions throughout his domain, the whistle signals continued to arrive, reports from watchers who had spent years learning to move unseen through the mountain wilderness. Each signal brought new information about Eric's approach, the disposition of his forces, and the equipment they carried. "They move like raiders," Harek interpreted the coded messages. "Confident, aggressive, expecting easy victory. That confidence will work in our favor when the fighting begins." Bjorn found himself studying the preparations with the eye of an experienced warrior, noting the careful thought that had gone into every defensive position. "You could hold this place against twice their numbers," he said. "Why not simply wait for them to exhaust themselves against your walls?" Harek paused in his preparations and turned to face the raiders who had unwittingly drawn his enemies to this place. "Because Eric's plan involves more than just killing me," he said. "He wants to discredit the legend, prove that the hermit of Skagard was nothing more than an aging warrior living on past reputation. Hiding behind walls doesn't serve that purpose." "Then what does?" Gunnar asked. "Meeting them on ground of my choosing, with advantages they don't expect, demonstrating why some legends become legendary." Harek lifted the storm cloak from its resting place, the ancient garment seeming to come alive in his hands. "Eric wants to face the hermit. Instead, he's going to face the warrior I was before I chose peace." The transformation that followed was something that would haunt the memories of all who witnessed it. As Harek donned the storm cloak, his entire presence seemed to shift and expand. The calm, measured hermit who had offered them mercy disappeared, replaced by something primal and terrible, a force of nature clothed in the trappings of war. The cloak itself seemed to respond to its wearer, the wolf and bear pelts arranging themselves as if they still possessed the spirits of the great beasts from which they came. The steel plates caught and reflected the firelight, creating the illusion of movement and life within the garment's depths. Most unsettling of all were the runes inscribed along its edges, which began to glow with a faint inner light as Harek's hands moved in patterns that spoke of old knowledge and older powers. Sweet Thor, Harold whispered, his voice barely audible. What have we unleashed? Nothing that wasn't already here, Harek replied, his voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. You've simply reminded me of who I was before I chose to be someone else. From the walls, he took Grimfrost, the war axe that had carved his legend across the northern kingdoms. As his hands closed around the familiar grip, the weapon seemed to sing with anticipation, its blade gleaming with an edge that had been honed by years of patient care. The reunion of warrior and weapon was like watching two halves of a single entity become whole again. The plan is simple, Harek announced as he completed his preparations. Eric expects to find me alone and vulnerable. Instead, he'll find me ready for war in a place of my choosing. You have a decision to make. Fight beside me as allies, or remain here as observers. Either choice is honorable. Bjorn looked at his men. Gunnar with his grizzled experience, Tormund with his careful wisdom, even Harold with his shame and growing understanding of what he had helped to unleash. They were not many, but they were warriors who understood the meaning of debt and honor. We came here as oath-breakers, Bjorn said finally. We'll stand as oath-keepers if you'll have us. Harek nodded slowly, something approaching warmth returning to his transformed features. Then we'll face Eric Bloodaxe together and see if his hunger for revenge has made him any wiser than it made him 15 years ago. Outside the stronghold, the sounds of approaching enemies grew steadily closer. Eric's force was moving with the confidence of hunters closing on trapped prey, unaware that their quarry had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. The mountain wilderness that had seemed so peaceful at dawn now hummed with the tension of approaching battle. As they prepared to leave the safety of the stronghold, Harek paused at the threshold and looked back at the simple life he had built over years of patient effort. The peaceful hermit who had offered mercy to desperate men was about to step aside, allowing the legendary warrior to reclaim his place in the world. Some choices, he said quietly, remake us whether we want them to or not. Then he stepped into the mountain morning, the storm cloak billowing around him like the wings of some great bird of prey, and began the descent toward a confrontation 15 years in the making. Behind him, the 4 raiders who had come seeking shelter found themselves following a legend into battle, bound by oaths and honor to stand against odds that would have seemed impossible only hours before. The hermit of Skagard was gone. What remained was Harek the Broadback, and the mountain itself seemed to hold its breath as he moved toward war. The valley where Harek chose to make his stand had been selected with the cold calculation of a master tactician. 3 narrow paths led into the natural amphitheater, each one overlooked by concealed positions where a single defender could hold off multiple attackers. Ancient pine trees provided cover while their fallen trunks created natural barriers that would force Eric's men to approach in small groups rather than as a unified force. At the center of the valley stood a massive boulder, a piece of the mountain itself that had broken away in some long-forgotten avalanche. Harek positioned himself beside this stone giant, Grimfrost in his hands and the storm cloak flowing around him like liquid shadow. To Eric's approaching warriors, he would appear as a lone figure standing in defiance of overwhelming odds. They could not see the carefully prepared positions where Bjorn and his men waited with crossbows or the various traps and obstacles that would channel their advance into predetermined killing zones. When Thundercaller, the war horn, sounded its deep, resonant call across the mountainside, the effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The horn was carved from the tusk of some legendary beast, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to reach into the bones of those who heard it. But this was more than mere sound. It was a summoning, a call that awakened something primal in both the land itself and in those who understood the old ways. Eric Bloodaxe emerged from the forest at the head of his force, his scarred face twisted in the same grin of anticipated victory he had worn 15 years earlier. Age had not been kind to him. His once powerful frame now showed the softness of too many seasons spent in halls rather than on battlefields. But his eyes still held the cruel intelligence that had made him dangerous, and the 60 warriors behind him moved with the disciplined precision of men who had fought together before. "Harek Eriksson," Eric called out, his voice carrying easily across the valley. The hermit who thought he could hide from the consequences of his pride. "Your time of reckoning has come." Harek said nothing in response. The storm cloak stirred around him as if moved by winds that touched nothing else, and Grimfrost caught the morning light along its perfectly honed edge. His silence was more unsettling than any boast or threat could have been. Eric's warriors began their advance with the confidence of men who believed they faced a cornered animal. They moved down the 3 paths in organized groups, shields locked and weapons ready, expecting to overwhelm a single defender through sheer numbers. The trap was working exactly as Harek had planned. When the first group reached the valley floor, Harek moved. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. One moment he stood motionless beside the great boulder. The next, he was among them like a force of nature unleashed. Grimfrost sang its terrible song as it carved through shield and armor with equal ease, each strike delivered with the precision of a master craftsman and the power of an avalanche. The first warrior never had time to raise his weapon. Grimfrost took him across the chest, the legendary blade cutting through, mail and leather as if they were cloth. The second managed to get his shield up, only to watch in horror as the war axe split both shield and arm with a single blow. But Harek was not simply relying on superior skill and legendary weapons. The years of preparation showed in every movement as he used the terrain to his advantage, positioning himself so that his enemies could only attack him 1 or 2 at a time, while their greater numbers became a hindrance rather than an advantage. The first crossbow bolt took an advancing warrior in the throat, gunner's accurate shooting dropping the man where he stood. More bolts followed from concealed positions, creating confusion and panic among Eric's forces as they realized they were not facing a lone hermit but a carefully coordinated defense. "It's a trap!" someone shouted from among Eric's men, but the warning came too late. The narrow confines of the valley and the carefully placed obstacles had already channeled their advance into exactly the positions Harek wanted them to occupy. Thundercaller sounded again, its voice now carrying notes of triumph and challenge. The war horn's call seemed to reach into every corner of the mountain wilderness, proclaiming that the hermit of Skagard had remembered how to make war. Eric himself pressed forward, determined to reach his ancient enemy despite the chaos erupting around him. His scarred face was flushed with rage and frustration as he watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into confused melee. This was not how his revenge was supposed to unfold. "Face me, you coward," he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of years of suppressed hatred. "Stop hiding behind tricks and treachery." Harek turned at the sound of Eric's voice, Grimfrost dripping with the blood of fallen enemies. For a moment, their eyes met across the battlefield, and Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with mountain wind. The battle reached its crescendo as Eric Bloodaxe fought his way through the chaos toward his ancient enemy, stepping over the bodies of his own men in his desperate hunger for personal vengeance. Behind him, what remained of his force, perhaps half the warriors he had brought into the valley, struggled to regroup and find some advantage in a fight that had turned completely against them. Harek stood amid the carnage like a figure carved from legend itself, the storm cloak flowing around him despite the absence of any wind. Grimfrost had drunk deeply of enemy blood, its blade gleaming with a light that seemed to come from within the steel itself. Around his feet lay the evidence of what 15 years of peace had not diminished, the absolutely lethal skill of a warrior born to make war. "You remember me now, don't you?" Eric gasped as he finally drew within speaking distance, his own weapon, a broad-bladed sword that had tasted blood in a dozen campaigns, trembling in his grip. "You remember the man you humiliated before witnesses? The chieftain you stripped of honor and territory? I remember a proud fool who mistook arrogance for strength. Harek replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty that had unnerved opponents for decades. Time has not made you any wiser, Harek Bloodaxe. Their personal combat began with a ring of steel on steel, two legendary warriors finally settling a grudge that had festered for 15 years. But where Harek fought with the desperate fury of a man whose entire identity depended on this victory, Harek fought with the patient skill of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Harek's attacks came in wild combinations, each blow powered by years of suppressed rage and humiliation. His sword work was impressive, the technique of a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. But it lacked the controlled precision that marked truly great warriors. He fought like a man trying to win quickly before his strength failed or his nerve broke. Harek, in contrast, seemed to have all the time in the world. He parried Harek's attacks with minimal effort, conserving his energy while allowing his opponent to exhaust himself against defenses that gave ground when pressed, but never quite broke. It was the fighting style of a master tactician, designed to wear down enemies while preserving his own strength for the decisive moment. Around them, the remaining battle began to wind down as Harek's surviving warriors found themselves outmatched and outmaneuvered at every turn. Some threw down their weapons and called for quarter. Others tried to flee back up the narrow paths that had brought them into the valley, only to find their retreat blocked by carefully positioned obstacles. From his belt, Harek drew the mercy blade, a small, perfectly balanced knife designed for a single purpose. In the old traditions, it was the weapon used to grant honorable death to fallen enemies who had fought bravely but were too wounded to survive. Its presence spoke to the thin line that separated justice from vengeance, mercy from brutality. "Yield," Harek said simply, as Harek's attacks grew increasingly desperate and uncontrolled. "Your men are defeated. Your cause is lost. There's no shame in acknowledging superior skill." But Harek was beyond rational thought now, driven by a madness that had been building for 15 years. "Never!" he screamed, launching himself in a final, reckless assault that left him completely exposed. Grimfrost moved with surgical precision, the war axe's blade taking Harek across the side with a blow that shattered ribs and sent him crashing to the rocky ground. He tried to rise, blood flowing from his mouth, but his body no longer obeyed his will. Harek knelt beside his fallen enemy, the mercy blade gleaming in his hand. For a moment, the two warriors looked at each other, one victorious but taking no joy in it, the other defeated but somehow relieved that the long burden of hatred was finally ending. "I could have been like you," Harek whispered, his voice barely audible. "I had the skill, the courage, the ambition. Why did I never learn to be content with what I won?" "Because you fought for glory instead of purpose," Harek replied gently, "and glory is never enough." The mercy blade moved once, quickly and cleanly, granting Harek Bloodaxe the honorable death the tradition demanded for a fallen warrior. As his ancient enemy breathed his last, Harek felt the weight of 15 years of exile lifting from his shoulders. Around the valley, the surviving members of Harek's force knelt in surrender, their weapons cast aside in recognition of defeat. They had come seeking easy victory over an aging hermit, and instead found themselves facing a legend in his full power. The lesson would not be forgotten by those who lived to carry word of what had transpired in the hidden valley of Skagard. Bjorn and his men emerged from their concealed positions, their faces showing the awe of warriors who had witnessed something beyond ordinary combat. They had seen legends fight before, but never with the controlled precision that marked Harek's victory over Harek Bloodaxe. The battle was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. 3 days after the battle that would become legend throughout the northern kingdoms, Harek sat outside his stronghold in the pale light of early morning, turning a simple river stone over and over in his weathered hands. The peace stone, as he had come to think of it, was nothing remarkable to look at. Just smooth granite worn by countless seasons of mountain weather until it fit perfectly in his palm. Yet it had become the most important object in his small world, a reminder of the choice that defined every man's character. The storm cloak of the berserkers hung once again from its place of honor inside the stronghold, carefully cleaned and maintained but silent now, waiting for a call that might never come. Grimfrost rested above the hearth in its leather wrappings. The legendary weapon returned to peaceful slumber after its brief awakening. The hermit of Skagard had reclaimed his domain from the warrior who had temporarily displaced him. Below in the valley where the battle had taken place, the evidence of violence was already being erased by mountain wind and weather. The bodies of the fallen had been buried with appropriate ceremony, Harek Bloodaxe in a place of honor befitting a chieftain who had died bravely, his followers in graves marked with simple stones that would remind future visitors of the price of breaking sacred oaths. Of the 60 warriors who had followed Harek into Skagard, barely 20 had survived the battle. Those who lived had been given a choice: swear new oaths of service to the hermit who had defeated them, or depart forever with the understanding that they would carry word of what had transpired to every settlement in the northern lands. Most had chosen exile, preferring the uncertainty of finding new lords to serve rather than remaining in a place where their defeat would be a daily reminder. But some had stayed. Tormund the Thin had been the first to kneel before Harek and request permission to remain in Skagard, not as a raider or conqueror, but as a guardian of the peace that had been so hard won. "I'm tired of wandering," the weathered warrior had said simply. "Tired of fighting for causes I don't understand, and lords who see me as expendable. Here at least, I know what I'm protecting." Gunnar Redbeard had followed, then young Harold, his shame over his betrayal transformed into fierce determination to prove his worth through loyal service. Even some of Harek's surviving followers had chosen to stay, recognizing in Harek the kind of leader they had always sought but never found. Now, as Harek watched the sun paint the distant peaks in shades of gold and copper, he reflected on the strange turns that fate had taken. He had sought solitude and found community. He had offered mercy to desperate men and gained loyal companions. Most surprising of all, he had defended his peace through war and somehow found that peace strengthened rather than destroyed. Bjorn approached through the morning mist, moving with the careful respect of a man who understood the weight of the moment. In his hands, he carried a simple wooden cup filled with water from the mountain spring that fed Harek's domain, an offering of service and symbol of purification. "The new men are settling in well," Bjorn reported, settling onto a fallen log where he could speak comfortably with his new lord. "Tormund has a good eye for defensive positions, and Harold's knowledge of Harek's network may prove useful if other enemies decide to test our strength." Harek nodded, accepting the cup and sipping the cold, clean water. "And what of you, Bjorn, son of Magnus? Have you found what you sought in these mountains?" The question went to the heart of everything that had transpired since desperate men had first crossed the warning stones into forbidden territory. Bjorn considered his words carefully, understanding that his answer would shape not just his own future, but the nature of the community they were building in this hidden valley. "I sought survival," he said finally. "Food for my men, shelter from the winter, a way to keep faith with those who depended on me. I found all of that, but I also found something more valuable, a purpose worth defending." "And what purpose is that?" Harek asked, though his slight smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Proving that honor still matters in a world that seems determined to forget it. Showing that sacred oaths have meaning beyond convenience. Building something that outlasts the men who create it." Bjorn paused, then added quietly, "My children will hear stories of this place. I want them to understand that some things are worth protecting, even when the cost seems too high to bear." The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning, mist and revealing the full scope of the domain they now shared. The fertile valleys that had attracted Harek's greed, the clear streams that provided life-sustaining water, the forests that offered game and timber, and 1,000 hidden places where a man could find solitude when he needed it. all of it protected now by oaths, freely given rather than imposed by force. "The world beyond these mountains will change," Harek observed, his attention focused on the distant peaks that marked the boundaries of their sanctuary. "New kings will rise and fall, new wars will consume the energy of ambitious men, new hardships will drive desperate people to desperate choices. But here we'll maintain something constant, a place where honor means something, where oaths are kept, where peace is preserved by those strong enough to wage war, but wise enough to choose otherwise." He placed the peace stone on the fallen log between them, its smooth surface catching the sunlight like captured starlight. Such a simple thing, worn by water and time until it embodied the patience that had shaped the mountains themselves. "This is what we fight for," Harek said simply. "Not conquest or glory or revenge, but the right to choose peace in a world that offers so few opportunities for such choice." As the two men sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun transform their mountain sanctuary into a vision of gold and green perfection, the legend of Harek the Broadback began its transformation into something larger than the sum of its parts. In years to come, when bards sang of the hermit who defeated 60 warriors to protect his domain, they would speak of strength and skill and legendary weapons. But those who had been there, who had witnessed the true nature of the man behind the legend, would remember something different. They would remember that the greatest victory was not won through force of arms, but through the choice to build something worth defending, a place where peace could flourish under the protection of those who understood its true value.